we've all made mistakes. We all need to learn from what we've gone through, right? And the only way that we move forward is to have really healthy, open discussions about that stuff. Everything we've been doing since we've been inside of Lenbrook has been about making sure that PCM audio sounds better, not just something that comes in as an MQA file.
The Fidelity Exchange, pulling back the curtain on brands shaping high-end audio and more.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Fidelity Exchange. I'm Drew Baird from Moon Audio, and today I'm doing something a little different. My customers have been asking me about MQA for years, and honestly, I had some questions too. So I went straight to the source to get answers. I'm talking with Mike Jbara, Vice President and General Manager of Lenbrook Media Group, which oversees MQA Labs. And here's what I discovered. While everyone was focused on the original MQA format story, Mike and the MQA Labs team have been quietly developing 5 technologies that could fundamentally change how we think about and listen to digital audio. Mike, welcome to the Fidelity Exchange.
Thank you, Drew. Really appreciate being here.
So Mike, tell me about your journey that led you to MQA Labs.
Well, it began with I would say, a failed music career, Drew. Actually, grew up thinking that life was going to be as a trumpet player, and I ended up leaving university as a mechanical engineer who happened to love music. Took me into the world of consulting, and ultimately that consulting world took me into the music industry, not on the microphone or performance side of it, but on the business and operations side. So I spent a little over 20 years inside of the Warner Music Group, with responsibilities that covered everything from transforming the business into a digital supply chain, overseeing the studios both for Warner and Atlantic Records, and most of the commercial responsibilities globally, both for the major label and for the independent label business. So always when you're in a company like that, where there's a lot of projects as well as day-to-day responsibility, you find yourselves wearing a couple of hats. And a colleague of mine and I were regularly looking at the quality of audio in the then early digital space. Because we grew a lot of the stuff at Warner out of the studios, we've been staring at digital audio for a decade before people were talking about music as digitalist, because that's how it moved around the studio and certainly moved to the manufacturing facilities. So in those early explorations and the early days of digital downloads, there was a lot of dissatisfaction from artists. Our A&R folks didn't love necessarily the way things sounded, and so we were really looking for ways to upgrade and improve what consumers were getting in those early days. It began what is essentially an RFP process, where we started to look for technology partners that could help us meet the needs of the artists that we were working with. I'll bypass a lot of the history and just say that resulted in a project that looked a lot like the first version of MQA. And Warner's partner in that exercise was Meridian, a UK-based high-end audio company.
Right.
Myself and my colleague had a long relationship with Bob Stewart going back to DVD and DVD audio days. And Meridian, as you may know, was the inventor of Meridian lossless packing, which was the first of the lossless coding technology. So we knew that innovation development and where was the future of digital audio going was front and center for Bob Stewart and the team there. So a project became a company, and I ended up going from a Warner guy on a Friday to an MQA guy on the next Monday, because the project became a company, and Warner and eventually Universal and Sony all became partners with MQA in launching what we believed was going to be an improvement to digital audio.
That's pretty interesting. I mean,
Sorry for the long story.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I think a lot of people don't know that sort of background. I think the bulk of audiophiles really look at MQA in the beginning as sort of the packaging, the unfolding, the way to get larger, higher quality resolution files over the internet, and title picking that up as their format to, get high resolution audio out to the masses. So, I think there's a lot. That's sort of in my intro, I talk about, I think there's a lot of confusion and misconceptions about MQA, that it wasn't just this technology, and it wasn't just done by Meridian and some manufacturers in DACs to produce a way to do multiple unfolds, one on the software side, one on the hardware manufacturers. Then they had to get certified devices so they could be able to do this and all this. I think what a lot of people don't really truly realize is that this was a different format and a way to produce a better sounding digital song, right?
Yeah, and it's what's interesting when people do, I guess, get themselves a little bit caught up in trying to fill in the blanks of what's happening or how did it get here. The business model was identical to what a Dolby does today or a DTS or anybody that has audio IP that they license to third parties. So in that way, it was very straightforward and there was nothing either nefarious or mysterious about the
Right.
business model. I think some of the challenges that we ran into at MQA was how the technology was introduced into the music and audio chain. The principle behind it was to give artists the ability to deliver to their fans what they heard in the studio. When it came to rolling the technology out into the supply chains of the music industry, it became clear, and we were told directly that it wasn't going to be possible to deliver an MQA file from the studio to the label and have it go successfully through the label supply chains because the labels were in a position of wanting to really simplify the number of formats they were receiving and then handle the encoding themselves. And so the idea of us now deploying the tools like the MQA encoder in a label supply chain, which is the rights holder in most cases for the music that they're delivering. However, they're not in the studio with the artist making the final creative decisions, already put us at least one step removed from where some of the creative decisions were being made. And so that created, I think, a little bit of tension or concern about, hey, what was being done to my music if I'm a creator? Now, 9 out of 10 times, people liked what they were hearing, even as artists and engineers. But in terms of where we sat in the chain, it was not something that they had the control over. That was the underlying principle behind launching the technology. And
Yeah.
so that started to create, I think, a little bit of concern about what was going on, who was making these decisions. Did creators really have the control that we wanted them to have?
And I think at the beginning, there weren't, aside from MQA on title, there weren't a lot of examples to really sort of, try out MQA. Like at the beginning, I'd always ask, can I hear an MQA file versus, a typical Red Book, if you will, file to do some comparisons to hear the differences. And I think for a long time, this was really hard to do. And is the only format that you can receive MQA over, streaming, or do they do MQA CDs? And, where else is the technology sort of being implemented, if you will?
Well, today, in just a 2 year period, we're light years beyond where MQA Limited was at the time, that it
Yeah.
went into the transition in 2023. So, when we had a chance to reflect, and a lot of this is a result of now inside of Lenbrook, just a really clear commercial mindset, which is, hey, we want to give the marketplace as much choice as possible. And Lenbrook, an early licensee of MQA, understood some of the challenges as well in terms of where we wanted to be positioned as opposed to where it did land in the marketplace. And so it led us to take a look at what was behind MQA and say, how do we deconstruct that into its building blocks? How do we take the fundamental principles that we believe absolutely still apply, which is how to get improved digital audio, either from the start or from a source, and how do we then turn that into solutions that are where they need to be in the marketplace and also quite format neutral.
Yeah.
So everything we've been doing since we've been inside of Lenbrook has been about making sure that PCM audio sounds better, not just something that comes in
Sure.
as an MQA file. So in that way, and I think you mentioned it earlier, we've deployed studio tools that now and finally give creators the control that was intended in the original MQA encoder. We've implemented tools that sit just at the DAC part of playback so that somebody can make a choice about whether this DAC and this playback device sounds the way they want. Some people will deploy that technology optionally, meaning it can be turned on and off, and other people will say that's the way we want our device to sound. And so you can find, I would say, some of the DNA of the original MQA now spread around the complete audio chain, but we think much more appropriately because it's in the hands and the decision is in the hands of either the user or the creator for how much or how little of that technology or the improvement to employ.
And how did Lenbrook get mixed in with MQA? How did the two sort of get together?
Lenbrook was one of the earliest licensees of MQA. I've learned it since being inside of the company, but I knew this and experienced it from our early relationship, which was Lenbrook really believed in supporting innovators and choice. And so Lenbrook doesn't have a view that there's a singular best way. They really want to make sure that people have an opportunity to have choice. They believe in innovation in general in the specialist audio category. I think the entire executive team there believes, hey, if there's not innovation and improvement, then why would people continue to invest in specialist audio and high-end audio equipment? So I think
Yeah.
it's about creating a really healthy ecosystem, not just for Lenbrook, but for everybody that's in the space. And it's a company, successful, privately held, not afraid to lead. And I think the history of the company, when you look at what NAD meant in its earliest days, is a company
Mhm.
that's very comfortable being on the leading edge of things, and having that innovation and breakthrough be part of the culture of the company.
And the really cool thing is that, we all hear differently, right? And honestly, I'm great with lots of different types of formats, to be totally honest, because one format may sound better to one person versus another person. I mean, the same thing comes down to equipment and genres of music that you listen to. We all hear differently, and we want different condiments, if you will, for our burger, right? And so I can't say that I've ever found one format that this is all I'm going to listen to. So I love that we're constantly trying to, invite new technologies so that we have a big palette to work with in terms of what we want to listen to, right? I love all these different types
Yeah.
of things in
Yeah,
MQA.
that I think that highlights also, or it speaks to the fact that no two recordings were made exactly the same. So you
Without a
have to
doubt.
realize that if you're dealing with already something that's been compromised from the beginning, there's only so much you can do with it.
Yeah, which leads to another thing. I mean, you can hear one album that's recorded in Japan, America, Germany, all these really cool places, and that same album can, while it's the exact same song, can sound slightly different, which is fun. It's part of the audiophile nervosa of trying to, hunt down which one's going to sound the best and add that one to your playlist or your collection or whatever. So I applaud it.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up, Drew, because one of the most interesting parts of the early days of MQA, having come from the music industry, having been responsible for the entire digital supply chain. So I
Hmm.
had a particular understanding of, let's call it provenance and how assets move through the creative process. That was
Yeah.
true when I was overseeing physical manufacturing, and we worried about things like which stamper was that CD being made from, because
Yeah.
artists cared about, hey, are you trying to make 50,000 units off the same stamper because eventually they wear out? Or
Hmm.
what was the original master and what have you guys done with it? And so this idea that you could have two or three different, let's call it masters in different regions of the world, maybe DSD coming from an Asian source and a 1630 tape, if you can imagine that, that would have been used in North America. The provenance discussion and the metadata that might track provenance was a real area of debate. And
Yeah.
I feel great about how all the music companies have tightened that up. I think there's a much greater appreciation for preserving the archive, knowing which one was the original source. It's obviously very important to creators. And then you can have discussions about, well, we then needed to do this with it in order to support this format. You could go back to even some of the earliest mastered for iTunes discussions where Apple was providing essentially plugins to the labels to do what they thought was optimization of masters for the formats that were going to be supported in iTunes. And somebody just makes a decision. Hey, do we think that that's creatively good?
Yeah.
I'm not going to comment on that, but if it was to give you the best experience through Apple Music, then people went down that path. And I don't think that should be seen as a compromise of a creator's vision. It should be perhaps a good commercial decision so that something is doing the best it can in that environment.
So let's talk about what you touched on earlier a little bit is the new technologies, the five technologies, the Focus, the Inspira, Endura. I don't even know how to say the next one. Qrona,
Chrono, Chrono. Think
Qrono,
chrono like a watch, almost like a
yeah,
chronograph. Think of it that
and
way.
Aria. So tell us a little bit about each one of those. Are some of these on the recording side? Are some of these on the end user side? How do they all get mixed in? How are they going to be used going forward in terms of, we're going to talk about in a little bit the NAD M33 that's going to implement some of this stuff. Why don't you go over each one of those so people
Sure,
understand them a little bit better? Because there's not a
I
huge amount
will.
of information on it yet.
I'm happy to go through it. And as a little bit of background, so I'm in the Lenbrook Media Group, and Lenbrook Media Group is, you can think of it almost as the software division of Lenbrook that sits alongside the hardware brand. So
Hmm.
um, the Blue Ops team lives in there in the Blue House platform, as well as all of the IP and the engineering team that came over as part of the MQA transaction. I bring that up because we have a really interesting and diverse team. We have recovering music industry executives like me. We have professional audio engineers that are now part of our team. We have tremendous DSP software developers. We have musicians. So we're fortunate that we also have a laboratory of creators to playback experts as we start to think about the product roadmap. So I'll start with the upstream stuff, which is Inspira and Endura. So Inspira is what many people would think of as an input plugin, something to be used in the recording or tracking process and in the mixing process. And then Endura is to be used in the mastering process. So both of these are used during the actual making of the records. And they bring the same principles to the workstation. They're just deployed differently because tools are used differently at different parts of the music recording, mixing, or mastering process. So both of them allow the engineers and producers, the people that are actually in the studio working with the single tracks, the multi-tracks, the flat mixes, and the final masters, to make decisions around some of the things that come from the artifacts created during the analog to digital process, pre-ringing and post-ringing, which are the things that are naturally a result of just the math of digital conversion. And so people can both use them to get back to what they think was the original performance, but they can also use our tools to introduce things. If they thought that for whatever reason they wanted an unusual amount of pre-ring, this is not just plug it in and it does it for you. We have defaults, but we also allow people to change them depending on what they want as their final recording. So one of them gets used there. One of them gets used in the final mastering process where you've got everything composed in the mixed final. Both of them tend to focus on letting people make choices around timing or impulse response characteristics, and then noise shaping, how do they create the quietest environment, or in some cases, not so quiet environment, to give the music the space that they want to give it. So those are two tools deployed now, available for sale for people to use. By the way, free trials are available for those so people can check it out. And then I'll talk about the rest of them. Focus is kind of a design that we've had for a long time in the analog to digital space that we didn't deploy in the, let's call it MQA 1.0 version of the technology. Focus employs many of the same principles. The idea is to avoid, in the first place, those things that happen during analog to digital conversion. And so Focus is a technology it's software deployed on an A to D chip. ESS is the first partner that's taking it out, but it's not an exclusive technology. And so it will be deployed with other partners as well. And it can either go into the studio process because people use A to D chips and IO boxes and all kinds of input devices. It also can live in the analog stage of a playback device. And so something like the M33V2, which we'll talk about later, the analog stage uses the Focus chip as a way of making sure you preserve the best possible input from an analog input. Area is our newest codec, and Area in some ways reflects the dreams of the founders. To some extent, it's taking advantage of everything that we've learned around lossless coding. It also takes advantage of what we know about what to preserve when data rates and network connectivity are degraded for whatever reason. So what really makes for great resolution, and how do you preserve that in real time if the network is wobbly, if you're on your mobile phone, whatever the reason might be. And so it's a fully scalable, dynamically adaptive, single technology. We're actually going to show it off as part of the upcoming streaming service, but it's also available right now for licensing and wireless applications. And it was originally developed as a wireless application coming out of some live development technology that we had done going back in 2017 and 18. And then Qrono, I'll talk about first just the term Qrono. Qrono represents the brand that will be attached to all of our playback technologies that are licensed. And then the first two pieces of Qrono that we've done, one was Qrono DSD, which was a new DSD to PCM converter, and then Qrono D to A. And Qrono D to A is basically filter, noise shaping, insights. In many ways, you can and think of it as almost a subset and an evolution at the same time of some of the thinking around MQA's
Mm-hmm.
decoding and rendering technology, but applicable to PCM audio. So Qrono on any device with any source will make that source sound better in our view. So hopefully that describes in some ways that deconstruction I was talking about earlier, which is, hey, let's break it all down to the principles and then figure out how to build solutions specific to the different parts of the chain, which means you'll
Got it.
also should expect to hear more coming from us in terms of
Right.
other tools and solutions.
So what's the timeline for all of these different technologies?
Area available for licensing today, Focus available for licensing today. The
Mm-hmm.
plugins are already in the market, available directly from our sites. And Qrono not only has been announced by Lenbrook under Lenbrook brand, but now there are third parties that have announced Qrono on their platforms. And so they're all out in the wild.
Yeah. So let's get into the first product from Lenbrook that's going to really enhance all of these. The M33 V2, which we can't wait to get our hands on. This has been a fun piece that we've played with, that and the M66, and I mean, I just love these pieces, and I'm really excited to play around with these new technologies. So let's dive into that M33 V2 and what parts of this puzzle will be in it, and how would customers use it and experience, as well as is this going to affect all streaming services that come to that product? So, Blue OS has a ton of different streaming services. Can you improve other services, to make them sound better?
I'll start with describing that Lenbrook Media Group lives independently from the Lenbrook brands that are in-house. And each of those brands has its own design and product philosophy that we not only don't influence or control, but we don't dictate how people decide to deploy our technologies as long as they're compliant with whatever our general brand guidelines are.
Right.
And so, like every third party relationship we have, and we have many of them, we will license into either NAD or Blue Sound or PSB with our technology, and they'll implement it as it makes sense. As you just pointed out, in the case of Lenbrook, we also happen to have BlueOS as a software platform that powers many of the experiences on these. But BlueOS itself is not the one size fits all in terms of feature set. So
Sure.
an NAD product may deploy different things on BlueOS than BlueSound would deploy on BlueOS. And you should expect to see even some of the LNG technologies implemented differently on those different brands internally as well as externally. So whether that's giving somebody the ability to toggle a feature on and off, or to deploy it in software as opposed to software and hardware or hardware only. So somebody might decide to put it in a microcontroller, and somebody else might say, hey, BlueOS team, build this feature in pure software. So those conversations are happening in real time. And as it relates then specifically to the M33 V2, it is a showcase for both the Qrono DSD playback technology and focus that you're talking about. We're excited that we're going to now have it in the analog stage of a playback device. We've been doing, as you might know, Drew, a lot of demos starting in Munich, where we played Focus for people on some recordings that were done on Focus. And so people have already had a chance to do the A/B listening. Want to make sure that you and your whole team have that as well, because I think you'll be excited about the difference.
Yeah, and I've heard a common word used many times in this conversation so far, and that's timing. Timing is a big deal in how we hear digital audio. Can you maybe dive into a little bit about that and why that's so important?
I would say that most of the things that inform our approach are a result of the last 20 years or so of neuroscience and psychoacoustics research, which is basically saying we as human beings and the way that our brain and our listening system works is different than what people perceive for probably 40 years. And so the ability for us to deliver time accurate information to the ear leads to far greater resolution than just worrying about the frequency of the information that you're delivering to the ear. And typically, historically, codecs have been built around optimizing frequency information. And so if you're really more focused on saying it's the arrival time, if you will, of each of the signals that makes for our ability to discern and separate two different sounds, but then you better lean into that and make sure that you're focusing on that with the data that's available to you. And so you can think of most of the things that we build as bottoms up design, kind of an elegant, hey, what's going to be necessary for you to be able to get the best timing information possible? And then let's make sure that all the other frequency information is carried along. It's kind of Bob used to talk about why you wouldn't put a bottle of wine in a 5-gallon sack. You don't need it for that. You should probably figure out what's needed and then surround it as such. And so we talk about timing because we believe that that's got to be the focus on how our technology looks at, analyzes, and then delivers the digital audio that's coming out the other side.
And then for beginners out there that don't understand pre-ringing and post-ringing, maybe dive into that a little bit, because that goes into that whole timing effect as well.
Yeah, the conversion of analog to digital audio is really just a set of approximations. I mean, I think everybody would remember from their junior high or middle school math, right, that you can't approach infinity, or you will approach infinity as you try to get to an analog signal. So on a practical basis, digital audio is a series of mathematical computations. Many people talk about quantization as these different approximations of the original analog signal. Well, you can get really good, but you can't get exact. And so when you do that, these artifacts, which are the results of these approximations being turned into a continuous or contiguous set of data points, they result in a little bit of noise in the signal is probably the simplest way to describe it. And so you want to find ways to filter out or counteract that noise so that you get back to as clean a version of the original analog signal as you can. And so that pre and post ringing is just how people sometimes, and if you're doing something on an actual meter and measuring it, you'll see it visually. A sound will begin before it was actually struck in the natural world, simply because of how these artifacts are laid into a digital file. And it's so hard to see visually and hear, and our brains are so sophisticated that they actually make up for those problems and try to do a very good job of eliminating that pre-ring, which is a sound beginning before it really began in the natural world, or something having resonance beyond the natural decay that you'd get in the natural world. That's the post-ringing part of it. So it's a little bit geeky in terms of its math,
Sure.
but your brain is working hard to try to eliminate or provide for those things, and we think we can help it out. And some of that research that I referred to earlier says, wow, our brain is so discrete and able to discern things at such a low level, we should work pretty hard to try to get to the signals as close to that level as we can.
So getting back to the NAD M33 V2, what can the consumers expect to benefit from all of this technology? Where are they really going to, really get enlightened by this piece of equipment?
I think if you're somebody that enjoys analog inputs to a playback device, we'd say you're getting analog, and I'll put quotes around it because you're going through a digital chain, but you're getting analog end to end. That should be pretty exciting,
Right.
because you're getting the benefit of that really clean input, and then what we think is the best playback because of both the amplification and the Qrono technology that's there. So an analog fan should love how it sounds. A digital fan is going to say, wow, these guys are actually applying as much as they can every step of the way to make sure that they're getting the best possible A to D and D to A experience out the other side of it. So I feel like as just a music fan, and I'm a person that listens to both analog and digital sources, it gives me something in both worlds that I'm excited about.
Yeah, I've really gotten back into, as of late, physical media. I went, obviously, years ago, we all dumped all of our CDs, ripped them all to hard drives, got into the streaming revolution. And quite frankly, I got a little tired of just having, streaming was a little too, I guess, in my mind, dumbing things down, where you just end up sitting on a couch and you just get lost in so much music without really thinking about it because you're just putting stuff on shuffle and whatnot. I've really gotten back into vinyl, and I know there was a resurgence of vinyl years ago, but honestly, I sort of put that on the back seat for a long time. I've really gotten back into vinyl. I've now gotten back into tape, not just cassette, but also reel to reel. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that part because I'm playing a lot with a lot of analog right now. So that should be a blast to play with. And I'm seeing a lot of people, and we're sort of going off into the psychology deep end now. With COVID happening years ago, we all sort of disappeared from getting together to listen to music, right? Everything has become so personalized. We're stuck on our little, phones in a corner with ear pods, and, social activity is going out the window. And I'm doing a lot of this to try and get my kids back involved in music. I want to sit down and open a vinyl sleeve and look at what was the name of the guy that got the coffee for the band while they were recording this album. I love reading all the stuff in the albums. So this is definitely going to be fun for me to play around with that M33 and vinyl and tape and see how much improvement I can get out of it. Because some of those analog philosophies in today's technology is a little flawed because it was tapes were done a long time ago. They don't sound as good as at least tapes compared to vinyl and digital. So this is going to be fun for me.
Drew, I think it's actually an exciting time for helping people get closer to the music that they love.
Yeah.
It looks like, and this might sound a little counterintuitive, but it looks like it's clear that when somebody's spending time, let's say in social, they aren't really interested in being taken from that space to listen to music. You can look at the data around TikTok and realize that people are there for the TikTok experience, not to discover new music, even if it is a
Right.
great source of new music. But it also means that when they're in their listening mode, they want to really get immersed in that. And I think it is a great chance to help people understand more about their favorite music. It's a great chance to point out to them, hey, did you ever know there was actually a rhythm guitar playing in the background on that? Like, did you ever
Right.
pick that up before?
Yeah.
We've always had fun, inside of our team talking about almost how to reintroduce people to instruments that they're hearing for the first time because they're
Sure.
finally getting access to the detail.
Yeah.
Because whether it was discovering it on radio or in, let's call it, compressed formats, some people are hearing things they've not heard before in songs that they thought they knew really well. That's fun.
Yeah. That reminds me of some stuff. Everything got squashed down to MP3s for the iPod revolution, right? And I think a lot of people have really lost their ability to discern just what you said. There's all this stuff in the music that was sort of lost because we had to compress everything so much to get file sizes so small so that we can get that 1,000 songs in our pocket. And now we're sort of going the opposite direction now that hard drives are so cheap. Bandwidth for internet in your house is, much larger than it ever was. We're gone to the days of the dial-up connections and everything dropping constantly and whatnot. So, the
Yeah.
future is great in terms of really sitting down and listening to albums and hearing things you've never heard before. In fact, there's one CD that I have by Patricia Barber that was recorded in a jazz club. And honestly, I'd never heard before until, and I had to listen to this on headphones. I found this unique discovery when listening with headphones instead of speakers is that there's actually a waitress behind me picking up glasses off of a table that I never picked up when I ever listened to it in speakers. But now when you listen to it in headphones, I could pick it up. And now I'm thinking about all this technology bringing those nuances out that, yes, people just never heard before.
Right on.
So, what do you think is the next big thing for MQA? Where is MQA going now? They've developed all these cool technologies, but there's always forward thinking in the future. What's sort of next for MQA?
The team has a streaming service in its future, and
Mm-hmm.
that streaming service will be a showcase of some of the technologies that you and I have been talking about today. So, Area will be the streaming format. It will preserve the best of what somebody delivers to us, whether they deliver a PCM master, an MQA master, or something else. So it's really going to show off what that technology is as a transmission codec. We're excited about that. Some people have started to write about it that have done the demos already of the streaming service and are talking about how seamless, flawless, and high quality it is at various data rates. So we're excited about that. Our team is going to focus on making the audio the best it possibly can be. And then we have partners that are worrying about the really heavy lifting part of ingesting all the audio, serving it up to consumers, making sure the support is there 24/7. So I would say there's a big project there that becomes a really fun 2026 calendar commercial event. And
Mm-hmm.
you'll definitely be part of helping us tell that story when we're doing that. And I think starting to get people to understand what area can do in the wireless space, both everything from across everything from Bluetooth connections and greater than that.
Great
So
point.
it performs at all levels and is spectacular. So area, I would say, is a real focus, and the streaming service becomes a showcase for it. The feedback so far around focus around Qrono D to A, the way that I would say even the traditional MQA licensees are starting to look at Qrono as an opportunity to offer that capability now to a much bigger audience because it's PCM friendly is great for us. So I would say those are the ones that are right in front of us
Yeah.
as the priorities.
I'm glad you brought up Bluetooth, because Bluetooth, similarly to, MP3s, was, a process of doing wireless at the beginning to make convenience really important. And early Bluetooth was just horrible, right? The sound wasn't great. It was just a convenience factor. The fact that you just said that really, sort of put a couple of light bulbs above my head about, this could really, really help Bluetooth audio and all wireless audio when they go to hopefully Wi-Fi, which is even, I think can get much higher resolution bandwidths, but we're dealing with battery issues and stuff like that with Wi-Fi and range issues with Wi-Fi. But, ultimately, and of course, I'm a cable manufacturer. Moon Audio is half cable manufacturer, half retailer. I always want wires to continue into the future because, right, it's the bread and butter of our business. But at the same time, there is always, a need for wireless, right? There are situations, especially with headphones, and implementing this into headphone designs and the DSP stuff that they're doing for noise reduction, which is, taking away, in my opinion, some of the qualities of the music. I can see this really helping that technology a lot. Big time.
It should, yeah. And there's going to be custom implementations of it, and we also expect it to be on board as services that are supported by a number of different chipsets.
Yeah.
But that also is a category that is going through a lot of change itself. I think we've all watched the evolution and maybe the slow and organic growth of UWB and
Yeah.
still have questions about the future of wireless connections.
Mm-hmm.
I think there have been a couple of fits and starts around wireless headphone experiences in the home.
Yeah.
And I still believe, and I believe that in general, consumers are going to find that to be a really satisfying experience, as long as things like transparency mode give them what they need in terms of local awareness and discretion and privacy. So I think there's so much innovation yet to be seen around the hearable space that we do think that area could be part of that story in the
Yeah.
relatively near term.
Do you know of anything in the Blue Sound circle of them integrating this stuff in the near future into all of their wireless speakers and technology?
One of the great things about having the teams all together is we're each other's laboratory and we sit around and talk about problems, not just in our company or our platforms, but across the chain. And so something like an area being deployed across BlueOS, we think makes a ton of sense. And that idea of having something that's adaptable and takes advantage of whatever your home network is capable of doing at the time and giving you the best possible audio, rather than necessarily having to make a decision to go to something lower quality just to guarantee stability. That's exciting to us because you can
Yeah.
increase range, you can increase quality, take it really be realistic about how many more devices are landing on somebody's home network at a given time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think you should expect to see that some of the technologies that we've talked about today would start to show up in some of the Lenbrook wireless communications as well. But that's true with third parties.
Yeah.
Anything that you and I have talked about today, it's not exclusive to Lenbrook.
Yeah.
We're a company that wants to support everybody that believes that we're going to be able to add value to their hardware or to their software experiences.
Last thing, more of a fun question. What music are you listening to right now? Who's really piquing your interest, or is there anybody from years ago that you've gotten back into? What's on your playlist right now?
You have to know that Prince is the Mozart of our time, in my opinion. So, in terms of my musical heritage and DNA, Prince and artists like Prince are always part of the rotation and the playlist.
Yeah.
Growing up in Detroit and growing up around the people in the community, and it was a very arts-centered community I grew up in. There's always been a lot of R&B and jazz in my life, which means it always cuts through. However, that to me is starting to show up more and more in the independent alternative artists of
Yeah.
today. So my sons are a constant source of music. What I'm starting to find over the last 3 to 4 years is having been in the music industry, I used to be able to introduce things to them,
Right.
even as the old guy. But because the discovery platforms for
Yeah.
music are so different and
Yeah.
they just hang out in places that I don't,
Mm.
music is getting introduced to them that doesn't make it onto the platforms that I'm on today. So it's an exciting time for me where I'm hearing from them about stuff that I need to check out, and I'm still able to introduce some things to them. But I would say of new music, I'm particularly focused on independent and alternative artists in the independent space because people are really, I think, doing a great job of living adjacent to what you and I might think of as the traditional genres and
Sure.
doing something really cool that brings together either R&B and independent rock or things like that. So, we have some artists that we're close to intentionally inside of our company because we like them, we support them, and they think like we do. But there's people like Ali Evenson, who I think is one of the most exciting young artists that's just starting to get on people's radar. But that's kind of a mix of the things that are you're always going to find me listening to. I'm
Yeah.
also somebody that really gets into listening, so all of my work background music has to be things without lyrics. So I'm typically like a classical or jazz listener
Yep.
for work, and then when
Yep.
I'm really doing my dedicated listening, the stuff that's going to get my attention, I have to step away from my machines and everything else and
Yep.
just take it in.
Yeah. I'm so the same way. Is there anything we haven't touched on? Did we miss anything? What do you think?
No, I think what's going to be interesting though is getting our community
Hmm.
to really embrace innovation, people trying things, having healthy discussions about choice. One of our learnings, I guess, from MQA 1.0 to 2.0 was proactive communication, transparency, putting it on the table, and then having healthy debate. Because when you don't do that, people fill in the blanks, and then you start having unproductive conversations as opposed to things that move the whole category forward. So anything that we could all do to encourage and to assume, hey, we're all actually trying to just improve the experience for creators and fans.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the thought I would leave you with, because I think that's how people should best interpret what we're doing inside of the Lenbrook Media Group. We're really just trying to advance the art. We're willing to put choice out there, and we're certainly open for feedback.
Yeah. So we got a lot of hi-fi shows coming up. Are you going to be at any of those? The next one we'll be at is Capital Audio Fest. Then I think Can Jam New York, and then Axpona. Are you going to be at any of the shows that you can introduce people to some of this information?
Well, we do a divide and conquer across the team because there are
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
many places to play, but
Sure.
you're definitely going to find Lenbrook Media Group people at those events.
Yeah.
And so happy to make sure that everybody's connected to run into somebody on that. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Mike, thank you so much for being willing to share the real story and pull back the curtain on what's happening with MQA Labs. Anything else you'd like to leave us with?
Drew, I just really appreciate you guys being willing to have these kinds of discussions. I think the more information that we can put out to people that are music fans, quality seekers, audiophile, anybody that really wants to spend some of their own personal time to understand the space better, this is a great platform for it, and really appreciate you doing the work.
Yeah, appreciate your time. And so, for everyone watching, if you want to understand how these MQA Lab technologies might impact your system, or you're curious about products like the NAD M33V2, Qrono implementations, the team at Moon Audio can help you figure out exactly what makes sense for your specific setup. All the links are going to be in the description below. And if you found this conversation valuable, if you appreciate that we went straight to the source to get the real answers rather than speculation, make sure you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notifications bell. We've got more conversations coming with other people in the industry, and innovative audio is always on our top hot list, not just for following trends. Mike, thanks again for chatting with us here at Moon Audio. I learned a ton today, and I know our viewers did too. We'll see you next time on the Fidelity Exchange.